So what is TSS? TSS, training stress score, is just a means of evaluating the stress of a training session. Now, we've put the calculation in there because it's not necessarily important to know the whole, understand the ins and outs of how the calculation works, but it is important to understand that it takes into account normalized power, normalized graded pace, or heart rate if you're using heart rate TSS, and the intensity factor. So the percentage of threshold that you're working out, 0.5 being 50%, 0.9 being 90%, and then it just divides that by your threshold for an hour. But we need to know that, it takes into account like normalized power, which we've described can sometimes be inaccurate for certain things, for certain durations, for certain like overall technical climbs. And then you start to take in a calculation of a calculation, and there can be an error built into that. So what we need to use is it is reproducible, so we can use it as a guide. Like, okay, on average, how stressful was that relative to other sessions? And like, how much do you use it, Matt?
I don't use TSS that much. So it's a really nice guide across the season, because then we can see how fatigue builds up and how fitness is tracking across many months or years. But there's still a bunch of things that we're not getting within the TSS or training load scores. So as far as TSS goes for the day, we're also not getting any information about what the athlete was doing the rest of the day. The other drawback to using TSS is that it doesn't account for all of the demands with neuromuscular power. So if we're doing massive sprints, or we're doing something like plyometrics or even strength training, there's no way to really quantify how relative a heavy squat was to your FTP. It's just not possible. Like, we know that how heavy the squat was, and we could probably work out the energy that was used. We can, but that's definitely not going to be relatable to a TSS score. So when we're looking at that across the season, it's not going to be perfect. And especially since we just showed some of the weaknesses or potential drawbacks with normalized power, it's not going to be perfect.
So how I use TSS is, I guess, more like across a week. I want to have a look at a trend about the more data we can utilize, the more we can kind of weed out the anomalies and the discrepancies day to day. So if I can have a look across a week, I can start to understand, look, every time we're hitting around 800 TSS for this athlete, they get really tired. Or we are now going to implement this really hard marathon-based run session. The TSS is bumping up, but I know that this may look like time or distance-wise just a similar week, but the TSS over the week starts to accumulate a lot. And as we'll get into in periodization next module, we talk about the performance management chart and monitoring, fatigue, overtraining, overreaching, all of those things. I like to use it across a week rather than per session. Per session, maybe I can have a look, but there's so many different factors, like you say, Matt, like how much fatigue are they carrying from an earlier session in the day before, and maybe 5 TSS points too much or too little. We don't actually know in terms of the follow-on fatigue day on day, week on week. So that's where using it like holistically is just another guide, another metric is really good.
Yeah, the more snapshots that we can get and the more little bits of information we can collect, such as TSS, the better we can build that whole holistic picture as the coach. So we can put together all these different kinds of sciences, these different parts of the science. So whether it's about their energy systems or about how they're handling a workload or anything, we're taking all this information, putting it together, and then we have a better picture. So we're definitely using all of this information at all times, but we're not using any single measurement as the thing. Cool. So Will, what do you think? What metrics should we actually be looking at, right? We have all of these things. What should we focus on?
All right. Yeah, I get asked that a lot, like athletes and just some coaches, like, what should I be looking at? And all of them, as we've discussed, but simplistically, cycling, you want to look at power and heart rate. Running, you want to look at normalized graded pace and heart rate. Depends, like you got like some road concrete monsters that are only going to run on the road and flat. Don't even worry about, you can just look at pace and heart rate. Otherwise, yeah, like cycling, power and heart rate, normalized graded pace and heart rate, you can't go wrong. It's going to tell you enough of what you need to know without having to spend potentially hours and hours over analyzing everything.
Yeah, not everything needs to be a deep dive. And that's, I think, what one of the things that we need to drive home is that even though we have access to all these metrics and these complicated analyses, we don't need to be doing that every single time.
That's right. So then we kind of discussed this, how accurate's TSS. We get that a lot.
Yep. So this is definitely a frequently asked question. And, we just talked about it. So like TSS is good, but it's not absolutely perfect. So don't be like going to bed at night being upset about your TSS for the week or the year or ever really. But it's a nice guide.
How do I know if my zones are correct?
Well, remember that all of these metrics are based around a threshold. So that threshold needs to be right, and we need to set that threshold during our max test, which is good for setting zones and gauging fitness as we go across a plane.
That's right. So just if you are concerned or you're not sure if your threshold's right, go to a threshold test. Just either have a look at one of our modules, one of our blogs, one of our podcasts, or just Google threshold test, go do it. And Training Peaks, great thing. It'll just notify you, update threshold. Otherwise, it should be relatively accurate and you can just input it into your settings and you're good to go. So check out module 3 if you want to know more of that. Otherwise, that's us for this time. If you want some more practical application of analyzing and monitoring your training, check out episode 36 of the podcast. Dr. Matt and I started the Performance Advantage podcast to help runners, riders, and outdoor competitors integrate sports science more effectively into their training and racing.
So over the last few years, Dr. Will and I have covered topics like the lactate threshold, training zones, power meters, and fatigue. Now we're condensing these popular and misunderstood topics into practical courses.
Our courses take our same podcasting style approach to learning and education, and we break it down into bite-sized chunks that you can digest either all at once or as practical little resources to use as and when you need them.
So the biggest difference between our course and any other course you might have taken is that we don't lecture you. It's a conversation between Will and I, and we're explaining complex sports science principles in an easy to understand manner.
Yeah, we also integrate how we use them on the regular. Our courses come with a certificate of completion as well as a lot of takeaway resources such as training plans, scientific articles, and quizzes that you can do to check your progress along the way.
Our sports science courses are available now. Register on performanceadvantagepodcast.com for immediate access.